Oh, Canada. Alright, living in Canada. To work for electronic arts in Canada meant, well, moving to Canada. And moving to Canada was no small feat. Having our household packed and crated, we drove to Vancouver, Canada from Huntington Beach, California, where we previously lived. But we had much more to do. We had to have our cat Sunico further immunized and obtain a certificate of health before she could immigrate herself to Canada with us. She hated the very long drive despite the vet prescribing some kitty Valium that was supposed to calm her nerves. Unfortunately, the kitty Valium just freaked her out and made her even more unhappy. We listened to the poor kitty and her tormented meows sorrowfully moan for hours and hours and hours until we finally reached the Canadian-USA border. Ironically, no one ever asked about the cat. We just went on through with no cat drama or any concerns by the Canadian Customs and Immigration. I have many random tales of events and experiences while living in British Columbia in the Pacific Northwest of Canada. I recall seeing a portrait of the Queen of England in the immigration office. I learned later that Canada sees itself as a crown country and operates many government businesses like auto insurance as crown corporations. As I was informed, Canada is part of the British Commonwealth, and so they recognize the Queen of England. And thus, her portrait was hung in the Customs and Immigration Office at the Canadian-USA border, where you enter Canada. The immigration officer had numerous questions and seemed to just rubber stamp us through, though, even with our cat. After some quick searching, we had no home yet, no place to put all of the things that were crated. We found an available brand new condominium in downtown Vancouver, British Columbia, in Canada. It had a window view overlooking the Burrard Inlet with seaplanes and ships passing often, just out of sound range, but picturesque without the disruption. We loved our condo in Vancouver. Despite the little office and tiny kitchen that it had, oh yes, only one person could actually fit in the kitchen at any given time, given its immense tininess. But its only drawback was that it was just under 1,100 square feet total. For two people, that may not seem too small, but it was. I made my office in a narrow but deep closet. My little table desk touched all three walls at the end of the closet. I would just walk into my office tunnel to play games or use my computer for email or work. Common to living in a dense urban city and in a skyrise, we parked in an underground parkade. Canadians call parking structures parkades, by the way. Therefore, we had to carry groceries and purchases from the garage into an elevator up to the 6th floor where we lived. I had used a computer cart for groceries, but we eventually purchased a collapsible wheeled grocery cart made for transporting groceries. It made it much easier. We also one time heard a cannon fire, and then we realized it fired every single day when we lived downtown in Vancouver. We were nearby Stanley Park, which had hiking paths, tennis courts, bike trails, and more. It was a great outdoor gathering place for big urban dense city people to go to. A cannon was inside Stanley Park, and apparently it was fired every day to signal a very important message, that the Americans had not yet invaded. Canadians feared that Americans might invade and capture Vancouver, and so they conceived to fire a cannon every day, indicating that they were not yet captured. After all, if they were captured, they would be unable to fire the cannon. It seemed a strange and backwards way to communicate, but that is what they did. And they kept that tradition ongoing well into modern days. Just tradition, and so they fired that cannon every day. As an aside, Canada, when under British control, invaded the United States and burned down the White House. I find it odd how few people actually know that bit of trivia. On another time, I visited Nova Scotia in Canada to see a developer. There were a few interesting tales from that trip. I recall it was insanely humid and hot. They're 4 hours ahead of the West Coast time zone, even more east than Florida. I recall an elderly man in a white horse-drawn carriage rode back and forth maybe half a mile in Lunenburg, a city downtown. No one rode with him that I ever saw. He just rode back and forth like an unused empty taxi looking for a rider that would never come. There is little to tell of this story really, but our car was broken into while we were at home, despite the car being locked behind barred gates to its camera-surveilled underground parking slot. Yes, where we live downtown in Vancouver, parking down below in the parkade, our car was broken into. The thieves managed to follow a car opening and pass through the gate. They tailgated their way through the security gate. Yes, that wasn't much security, obviously. The thieves went down and down to the very bottom of the parkade to reduce any odds that they might be seen. Apparently they knew the blind areas where camera surveillance systems could not see, and they knew therefore which rows of cars could be victimized. They were professionals. Our car was in the row that the car thieves attacked. They inserted a tool into the driver's door lock and they ripped the lock directly out of the door, destroying the lock and the door frame and its harness. Then they opened the glove compartment and popped the trunk to take anything remotely of value, even dimes and pennies. They took literally everything. We learned that there is nothing to be done about a car break-in in British Columbia, Vancouver, but to accept and just move on. The government had given up on fighting that crime. It was too petty, too insignificant compared to the bigger issues, like the Hells Angels smuggling in heroin via submarines. Yeah, Canada had weird and bizarre criminal problems that made them ignore petty crimes like car break-ins. So what are the consequences of such lax law enforcement? Well, I saw it firsthand, and the statistics say it unequivocally. British Columbia has the highest auto break-in rate in all of North America, much less within Canada. It's obvious to me there are harmful consequences when you selectively enforce laws. After many years of success at Electronic Arts in Canada, I was promoted to Chief Technology Officer over the Fusion Business Unit. I would later become Chief Operating Officer, and the replacement CTO, Chief Technology Officer, would report to me as well. With my success and corresponding stock grants at EA, I was able to liquidate them, so that Catherine and I had the down payment necessary to purchase a house in a nearby city called Port Moody. It was a tri-level home with an additional basement grandmother suite. The house was built on a hillside. Its staircase descended from the main floor down to a mid-hill large room that we made into a media room, and continued down from there to the grandmother suite, which was a complete apartment with one bedroom, bath, shower, and kitchen, etc. And the staircase ascended to a second floor that oversaw a green belt that was behind the house. Further, 3 total plus stories to the backyard. It was quite the sloping home. Inside the house, there was a huge 20-foot vaulted ceiling with walkways crossing the upper floor, with views to the massive family and living room areas below. The kitchen was huge, like a ranch-style open kitchen, with a center island to aid cooking and food preparation. I believe the house remains one of the most expensive and impressive houses that we'd ever lived in. It was nice, it was posh, it was sophisticated. As an aside, we had to sell that house at a loss during the financial meltdown when moving back to the United States many years later. The first year that we lived in Port Moody, British Columbia, we experienced what the local news declared as an extreme snowstorm. It was Snowmageddon in British Columbia. The snow came down and it seemed to never stop. I was a stalwart though, and I rose early morning as day broke, and armed with a 4-foot wide snow shovel, I shoveled for over an hour, clearing the walkway from the street to the front door, and then proceeded to the driveway, from the garage to the street as well. After a week of snowing off and on, mostly on, the sides of our driveway became piled 6 to 8 feet tall of snow that I had been tossing up as I did my shoveling each day. The snow banks were huge. There was nothing visible anymore on either side. Undisturbed, pure snowfall kept coming from the heavens. It was absolutely everywhere. While it was beautiful, it was hazardous, if not outright deadly. Despite its snowing at most 2 weeks a year in the greater Vancouver area, its drivers seemed totally ignorant on how to drive in snow at any time. Many people had studded snow tires to swap on for the snow months that might potentially bring snowfall, but they were illegal to use during non-snow months in Vancouver due to potential damage to the roads. And while that afforded more traction, people still drove like boneheads without respect for the skid and slide threats and snow and ice and black ice. Not to mention other people that may not have the same equipment or gear they do, or know how to drive themselves in the snow. Driving in Vancouver in the snow was crazy. Driving in the snow was dangerous. There was no better option, however, to get around at the time. If anything, I thought Vancouver drivers believed that they knew how to drive really well in snow, and that confidence led them into numerous slippy, dangerous situations. Well, anyway, I drove to work every day in the snow, no matter how insane people thought I was for doing so. My work ethic was unstoppable, and I had a 4x4. One day, there were only a handful of people in the entire studio of normally over 1,000 people. It was Snowmageddon, Ghost Town. Although driving in the snow was scary, I did it successfully without any major incidents. I even stopped to buy anniversary orchids during a sleet and snow downpour. It was important. At home, one morning we heard a huge sliding rumble and a crashing sound, followed by an explosion. Catherine and I rushed outside to see what had happened. A huge, foot-plus thick sheet of ice, maybe 10 feet by 9 feet, had separated from our roof's icy layered sheets and slid down like a gigantic guillotine, slicing anything and everything on its way to the porch and the ground. The roof was slanted to allow water to run off, and so the ice ran off and the ice blade came down as if from hell. Had anyone been underneath that sheet, they would have been dead. It was incredibly huge, massive, heavy, and undoubtedly sharp. And it came down within seconds of the thunderous sounds. Lesson learned: never stand outside a building near its sides or beneath its roof after a snow, especially if you see a snowpack or ice on its roof. Although I interviewed literally well over 1,000 people during my time in EA Fusion, some people stood out to me as especially good, extraordinary, and a few remarkably especially bad. At one point, we interviewed a native Montreal French-Canadian named Albin Wood, who had moved and been working in Switzerland for a watch company to create software to track timers and countdowns at Olympic events. I had no idea there was a dedicated job just for Olympic clock timers, but that is what Albin's job was. Interestingly, Albin was also an Olympic fencing champion. He did not place high enough to earn a medal, but his participation in the Olympics was a huge achievement for him as a young man. Realizing that he was unlikely to become a world fencing champion after his Olympic defeat, he decided to pursue his passion in engineering as a career. Albin was a legitimate genius and employed his talent towards engineering. He began learning traditional programming languages and data structures and algorithms as they were taught in school. He then learned to program games on his own and managed to get a job working at Omega, like I said, on clocks. But now he was back to doing games, his passion, even if it was a hobby. He hoped to get a real game to do that. And that's why he was interviewing with us, Electronic Arts. While I could tell numerous tales of Alban Wood's extraordinary talent and remarkable personal integrity and his commitment to family and friends, perhaps one of his standout traits, in addition to those, Alban also suffered tremendous anxiety over his ability to succeed and his family's dependence on him as a cornerstone of their lives and as their sole source of money, all living in Canada. His wife was native Switzerland, and moving to Canada just as she was pregnant added to his anxiety. His future firstborn daughter was tremendous strain to Alban, but he was impassioned and excited to have her. Alas, Alban's stress manifested in his torment, driving him to march around the office buildings to burn off stress. He developed rashes that doctors could not treat, and so he used salves and ointments to offset their agitation. It was apparent to me that greatness comes at a price. Alban paid for his immense talent with his inner peace. I have often wondered if Alban's success in his job and family will fully compensate him for all the suffering that he had to endure just to thrive. In life, there have been scant few people that I would call true friends. Alban Wood was one of those few people. We battled so much together in terms of work challenges and missions, technology and engineering and networking, and optimization and game development and game design quests. I am proud to say that Alban would march into hell to fight its hordes just as I would do so for him. I think that is what true friends would do. They would march into hell for each other. Later on, during my work with Alban, we hired a man named Gaz Iqbal. Gaz struggled with the English language to the point that most people considered him unintelligible and frankly unworthy of their time to even talk to. That was a huge mistake by most people because Gaz was insanely intelligent and super motivated to succeed. Partnered with Alban as his sensei to teach Gaz and guide and shape his innate talents, Alban empowered Gaz to soar in his expertise and tremendous value to the company. At one point, behind closed doors, I recall executives in Electronic Arts made clear to me that Gaz was my employee and that I had to make sure he got along with everyone and could communicate effectively. I was offended at the notion that someone with such remarkable talent would even be remotely questioned because of his communication challenges and his introvert personality, which honestly was likely further fanned by his English-speaking difficulties. Since I was subordinate in the organization, I could only answer, okay. But I stressed that there had been no issues that I had ever heard of from he or Alban that were problems for the business. I said I thought it was dumb. Gaz proved to be one of the best engineers that we had in the division. Fortunately, as they said, he was my employee. So I made sure he was successful, just like he did for himself. One of the most memorable moments for me of Alban and Gaz working together was early during experimentations with the Sony PlayStation Portable, PSP, prototype hardware. Alban and Gaz stood in front of our then about 85-person team and held up 2 physical wires, with each wire attached to a separate PlayStation Portable prototype hardware device. As they moved the 2 wire ends closer to each other, suddenly The two PSPs communicated with each other without a wired connection. They were communicating wirelessly. That may sound like nothing special since so many things operate wirelessly, even then. However, this was a big deal because the PlayStation Portable did not have wireless hardware yet. Albin and Gaz had discovered that the PSP did have a transceiver hardware built in, but it did not have any way to radio transmit. It had no antennas. So their solution was to physically move wires close enough to it to create an amplification so that they effectively did have antennas. And it worked. Even Sony, the maker of the hardware, the PSP, had not even achieved what Albin and Gaz had done. Again, they were geniuses, and they were cornerstones to the connectivity across all games of Electronic Arts Fusion.